This is the Station for Negotiation podcast, episode number 57. My name is Gene Killian. I've been a lawyer and professional negotiator for 40 years. Today, folks, I wanted to talk to you about the Women's National Basketball Association, the WNBA. And the reason I want to talk to you about them is because they've just negotiated a historic collective bargaining agreement with their players' union. And the average player's salary, for example, under the new CBA has gone from $120,000 a year to $583,000 a year. And the players were successful in negotiating a bunch of other improvements to their professional and personal lives through this CBA. And, you know, I was hesitant to talk about this topic because it tells you where we are in America these days. Like everything else in the United States, this topic is politically fraught. Somehow the league has become the center of sometimes sort of political tension. People on the left tend to like the WNBA because it stands for women's empowerment in their view. It celebrates openly gay players, and it's involved in social justice initiatives. And people on the right, some people on the right tend to dislike it for some of the same reasons. And they like to say things like, go woke, go broke, pointing to the WNBA's inability to survive on its own financially yet. The whole thing is just exhausting. Politics in the United States are exhausting. I look at the league and I see a showcase for some enormously talented world-class athletes. And over the years, you've had WNBA players like Cynthia Cooper, Cheryl Swoops, Lisa Leslie, Diana Taurasi, Sue Bird, Maya Moore, and lots of others. And now, you know, we have players like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, and just they're phenomenal athletes, and the quality of play is really quite high. It's definitely worth taking a look at. But I would like everybody to stay away from politics as we go through this discussion, because really what we're talking about is business. And I think if we look at some of the newspaper reports of this negotiation and how the media reported it, we can learn some valuable lessons as negotiators and students of negotiation. But let me start with a little bit of background on the WNBA. The WNBA was founded in 1997, and since then it's been heavily subsidized by the National Basketball Association, the NBA. And for years, the league just kind of survived. It's never been a big moneymaker. And in fact, it's never turned a profit in nearly 3 decades of existence. Based on the newspaper reports, it loses about $40 to $50 million a year. And that's including in recent seasons. And it relies on large subsidies from the NBA to stay afloat. But that seems to be starting to turn. And as Bob Dylan said, the times they are a-changin'. And a lot of people are betting on the league's success right now. Why? Well, the financial picture is a lot more nuanced than simply saying the NBA keeps the lights on. The WNBA ownership is split 3 ways. 42% of the WNBA is controlled by NBA owners. 42% is controlled by WNBA team owners. And now 16% is controlled by outside investors who recently contributed $75 million in capital to the league in 2022. And the league has now amassed nearly $1 billion in expansion fees since 2023. New franchises in Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, each fetching $250 million. So this is no longer a struggling league. It's a league that investors are betting heavily on. And the WNBA secured a new $2.2 billion media rights deal recently. And now they have, as a result of the CBA negotiation, a revenue sharing plan that ties player pay directly to the growth of the league, meaning both sides, management of the WNBA and the players, have aligned incentives to grow the league. So the honest answer right now is the WNBA is currently structured, probably could not survive without ongoing NBA support, but it's changing. And the new CBA is part of that change. And the question really isn't if anymore with respect to this league, it's when. Now, the league, in my view, really started to turn when Adam Silver, who's the commissioner of the NBA, was smart enough to hire Kathy Engelbert as the commissioner of the WNBA in 2019. And let's talk a bit about Cathy Engelbert's background. Cathy Engelbert is a remarkable person, really a role model for young women. She came from a large family, 8 kids. She had 5 brothers, so you know that she has sharp elbows just from having 5 brothers. Her father was a professional basketball player. He was drafted by the Detroit Pistons in 1957. He played in the league for a few years. And she went to Lehigh University, where she became a team captain in lacrosse and basketball. So she's a gifted athlete herself. She went to work after graduating from college at Deloitte, which is a Big 4 accounting firm. And she was elected the first female chief executive officer of Deloitte, which is a very large organization. In fact, one of the world's largest professional services firms. And so she definitely has the background to run this league. And she's been quoted as saying, "Sports is big business and business is about relationships." Just a great move by Adam Silver to hire her. And when you listen to her talk, when she's interviewed, she came in with a clear plan. And her plan was, after studying other leagues, number 1, players first. Let's take care of our players. Number 2, I want to ensure stakeholder success. And number 3, we need more fan engagement. We need to make it easy for fans to find us. How do you get fan engagement? She's given interviews on this, and it's fascinating to listen to her talk because she studied other leagues. And she says, one thing we need is rivalries. You know, we need old school rivalries like other leagues have. The Celtics against the Knicks, for example, the Yankees against the Red Sox. That kind of rivalry is what we need in this league. And we need household names. We need lots of household names in the league to attract fans. And recently, they were able to bring in Caitlin Clark, who was an All-American basketball player from the University of Iowa. And Caitlin Clark really became the face of the league for a little while. And that, of course, created all sorts of political controversy, too, that I won't go into. And they also brought in a player named Angel Reese, terrific player from LSU. And Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark became rivals, and it really kind of ginned up interest in the league. And Cathy Engelbert said, we also need games of consequence, games between rivals that people want to see, appointment television, so to speak. So those were her plans. She hasn't gotten all of those plans implemented, but the league is moving toward those models. One thing remarkable about Cathy Engelbert is not long after she became the commissioner of the WNBA, the pandemic hit, the COVID-19 pandemic. And it hit at a particularly vulnerable time for the league. And if she had not handled that problem well, the league would have been in very serious trouble. But they moved quickly. They created a pandemic isolation zone at a location in Bradenton, Florida, which was nicknamed the Wubble, which is a combination of women and bubble. And they played a condensed 22-game season in this Wubble, and they had about 300 people total inside the isolation zone, including players and staff and families. They were very concerned about the long-term impact of being out of sight of their fans for 20 months if they couldn't pull off an entire season. And Cathy Engelbert was very blunt about the stakes. She said, quote, "We might not have survived if we couldn't pull off the bubble season. It was important for our sponsors and our media partners for us to be able to move forward," period, close quote. And she got them through that season. They survived. And as I said, they were able to convince investors to invest over $70 million in this league. In fact, a few months after the 2020 season ended, she launched a capital raise that really helped to supercharge the league's growth and reach. And stakeholders have said that that raise, the capital raise and the growth that followed, wouldn't have been possible without the credibility of the bubble season established with sponsors and their media partners. Pretty amazing. And players like Alicia Clark, who was central to the recent CBA negotiations, said plainly, quote, "That season was a lot bigger than any of us as players and bigger than the league. Where we are as a league right now, honestly, is because we did that," period, close quote. And so they worked hard to get through this pandemic season. They increased their visibility. They brought in great players. And then the next major hurdle was the new collective bargaining agreement negotiation. And it was a contentious negotiation that just concluded as I'm sitting here in 2026. In 2025, the WNBA salary cap for the entire team sat around $1.5 million annually. And the Supermax, which is the highest amount you can pay to one of your players, was about $250,000. So that's for the best female basketball players in the world, and it's less than many mid-level corporate salaries. And Kathy Engelbert, who's negotiating for management, remember, she said we have to take care of our players, has that in her mind as this process works. But Kathy Engelbert is also a very, very savvy negotiator. She's politically savvy. As I said, she rose to the top of one of the biggest financial organizations in the accounting field. And, let's face it, it's been a man's world in those top four accounting firms. She broke through and was successful there. And as I said, is a very competitive person. She was a top-notch athlete. So she's going to be a tough negotiator. I don't have to be in the room with Kathy Engelbert to know this is going to be a tough negotiator. Now, the WNBA players did a good move at the beginning of this, a lot of them. The WNBA players opted out of the previous collective bargaining agreement in October 2024. That was not a snap decision. That was a calculated move. The players were signaling that they were willing to walk into an uncertain situation rather than accept the status quo. And that's where this whole thing begins. So, as I said, it's a contentious negotiation, which leads me to the first thing we can learn from this negotiation, which is don't take it personally. Let me repeat that. Don't take it personally. In any tough negotiation, you're going to get frustrated. You're going to think maybe this person is not treating me fairly. I don't like the way this negotiation is going, and I feel like I'm being attacked. Remember what I just told you. Don't take it personally. Remember what Michael Corleone said in The Godfather. This is business, not personal. And, listen, in my career, I've had to deal with this many, many times in tough negotiations. Insurance companies, who I deal with all the time, are incredibly tough negotiators. And I remember one guy I used to negotiate with all the time. He represented a large insurance company. No matter what my case was about, what my claim was about, when we would get involved in a negotiation, he would say something to me at the beginning like, now listen, you just want nuisance value for this, right? Because your claim is not that great. No matter what my claim was, he would say the same thing. And for a while, I would get aggravated because obviously I wouldn't be trying to collect on these enormous claims from my clients unless I thought they had value. But I realized after a while, this is just a negotiation technique. Nothing to get upset about. And here in this WNBA negotiation, the players wanted a lot of things. For example, they wanted 20% of the league's revenue in terms of a revenue sharing plan. Plus, they wanted to go to a $9.5 million salary cap per team. Now, remember, the salary cap at the time is $1.5 million. So that's an enormous leap. And the players make a proposal to the league at the beginning of January. And here's what Kathy Engelberg and the league do. They sit on it. They basically ignore it for 6 weeks. They don't respond. They don't reply. They basically just acknowledge they got it. And if you're in a negotiation, that's the kind of thing that you can take personally sometimes. You think you're being ignored. In fact, we have some quotes here from WNBA players. Back in January of this year, Union Vice President Nafisa Collier told ESPN that the league's tone in negotiations had been dismissive and disrespectful, and that in the initial conversations, the players had been repeatedly told that they didn't understand the business. Now, I wasn't in the room, but consider Kathy Engelbert's background as the head of this accounting firm. Can't you hear her saying, hey guys, I was the head of a major accounting firm. I understand numbers. You guys just don't understand how this business works. I don't know if she said that, but that's certainly what the players are hearing. And nobody likes being preached to. Nobody likes being lectured or being talked down to. So that aggravated some of the union leadership. But again, remember, don't take it personally. Neko Agumike, who is the president of the union, said that she felt there had been no, quote, cultivation of a culture of trust, close quote. And the newspapers quoted one anonymous player as saying, "You want Applebee's and I want Chipotle. We can't even figure out what our order is." But remember something. When you start getting lectured in a negotiation, just remember that is a classic aggressive negotiation technique. When someone treats the other side as an adversary who needs to be educated instead of a partner who needs to be heard, that is a classic aggressive negotiation technique. So just remember it for what it is, or recognize it for what it is. It's just a negotiation technique. I'm going to let it roll off my back. I'm going to focus on the real issues here. And what's your goal? As we often talk about on this podcast, your goal is to somehow turn this into a joint problem-solving exercise and get away from negotiation as competition. So that's number one. Yes, there were aggressive moves made by the league, but the key to getting to a negotiated solution is to ignore them and to focus on the problem. Now, that leads me to rule number 2, another lesson from this negotiation, which is a handful of patience is worth more than a bushel of brains. Let me repeat that because it's important. A handful of patience is worth more than a bushel of brains. Now, here the players were both smart and patient, as I'll explain. But I have to tell you, I'm not famous for my patience. You can ask my wife. I am not by nature a patient person. And I think a lot of Americans and Westerners are not very patient, period, especially in this day and age of 20-second sound bites. We want something right now. I mean, I really don't want to go through this whole process. I want it done right now. But over the years of negotiating, I have had to realize that patience is the key to being an effective negotiator. The best negotiators are patient to a fault. And whatever you have to do to develop patience, for me, it was to take up some meditation and learn some, sort of coping techniques to become more patient. Whatever you have to do that, do it if you're involved in negotiation, because the longer you can wait and let things develop, the more opportunities will arise in the negotiation. Here, let's talk about what the players did. They did something strategically brilliant before anyone even sat down at the negotiation table. At the time this negotiation took place, more than 75% of the league's players were free agents. In other words, they had declared themselves as being unattached to the league or to any team. How? Because they deliberately avoided signing any contracts that extended past 2025, specifically to take advantage of potentially higher salaries in a new collective bargaining agreement. Now think about the patience and faith that takes, because they turned down short-term money individually in order to hold out for a better collective deal. So that involves coordination, patience, trust, and real restraint, and it gave the union enormous leverage. And part of the reason it gave the union enormous leverage is because the players were saying, look, we can go overseas and play. There's other leagues. We don't have to play for the WNBA. And meanwhile, the league itself was under deadline pressure for all the aggressive moves that Kathy Engelbert and management took. The truth is that everybody knew that the 2026 season was supposed to start on May 8th, which was the league's 30th anniversary, and 2 new expansion teams in Portland and Toronto were preparing to launch. Missing that window and missing these deadlines would have been catastrophically expensive for the league, and not only that, would have aggravated the people who just contributed this enormous capital raise for the league. So We often talk about BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And here, the players had one. As I said, most could play overseas for substantial money, and that outside option gave them real leverage at the table. And this negotiation, you want to talk about patience, it went on. The negotiation sessions lasted 8 full days, going well into the early morning hours each night, more than 100 hours of negotiation. And for many at the table, this was new territory. Ogumike, who was the president of the union, said she had to apologize to her executive committee for not warning them how long this was going to take. And unlike the previous collective bargaining agreement negotiations in 2019, which took only one late night in-person session, she had a feeling this one was going to take a long time. But even she didn't anticipate how long, she said. And Ogumike identified something crucial about how to make progress in these negotiations. She said, and I'm going to quote this because it's important. She said, quote, "Up until Friday, the small groups we were meeting in were more effective," close quote, meaning than the large plenary sessions, the sessions with everybody in the room. And there's a reason for that. When you're in a big room and there's a lot of people in the room, they tend to harden their positions. They say things to make their colleagues feel how tough they are. And it tends to calcify positions. But when you get out of that room into smaller groups and you just talk in the hall to someone on the other side, you start building trust. And that's what happened here. Because they were together for so long, people from the union would go into the hall, maybe have a cup of coffee with someone from the other side and start building trust. Let's talk about what it's actually like to be inside a negotiation that goes 100 hours, because it's not all tense standoffs and dramatic declarations. Between the proposals here, going back and forth across the table, there was a lot of downtime. And there were pool tables, so the players would be playing pool. They had a gym, so the players would be working out. And they were watching television shows on their phones while they were waiting for proposals to come back. But one Sunday night in the negotiation was particularly funny because a bunch of players gathered around Alicia Clark's laptop to watch the Oscars during a little bit of downtime. For some reason, they couldn't get the Oscar show on any of the big screens at the WNBA offices. And as you probably know, Michael B. Jordan won the Oscar for Best Actor, and everybody watching on the laptop let out a loud scream, so loud that the staff from both sides came running down the hall thinking that there had just been a major breakthrough in the negotiation. And the players had to say, "No, we were just watching the Oscars, sorry." And that tells you everything about the atmosphere in the room. People were exhausted, but there was also a human aspect to this and a funny aspect to this, so the negotiations kept going. Another funny story was these negotiations carried over St. Patrick's Day in New York. And I don't know how many of you have experienced St. Patrick's Day in New York. I will just say this. When I worked in New York, I would commute from northern New Jersey by bus. And on St. Patrick's Day, people would get on the bus at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they were already 3 sheets to the wind going to this parade in New York. And I didn't understand how they were going to actually make it to the parade because some of them were pretty drunk. And I always remember that when I would take the bus home at night, none of these people would be on the bus. So I was wondering whatever happened to them and whether they were sleeping in Central Park or something. But the funny part of this is these negotiations took place at various locations in New York, including the Langham Hotel. And at one point, the WNBA staff had to roll a cart up Fifth Avenue with printers, monitors, and electronic equipment right through the middle of the St. Patrick's Day parade for 14 blocks. And I can't even imagine what that must have been like, trying to avoid the drunks in the middle of the street. But somehow they did it. And there you go. We have historic labor negotiations, green hats, and bagpipes all being mixed together, something I think you probably could only experience in New York. But this kind of shows kind of the the human side of an in-person meeting. Listen, I negotiate a lot. And now, post-pandemic, I mean, a lot of negotiations are still conducted virtually via Zoom and Teams. But there's something to getting together, getting people together in a room that creates a chemistry and a dynamic and a sense of fun that you tend not to have in virtual negotiations. That's not to say we should get rid of virtual negotiations. They're less costly, and I've found them to be effective. But if you have a really complicated negotiation, you want to think about having it in person. It just creates a different dynamic. And that's going to lead me to rule number 3. And it is this: most people don't want to hear about labor pains. They just want to see the baby. Forgive my pun about labor, but I'll repeat that. Most people don't want to hear about labor pains. They just want to see the baby. What do I mean by that? Your opponent in a negotiation usually is not going to want to hear about your transaction costs or all the problems you have. They may pay lip service to that. They may show you empathy, but usually they're just interested in what's good for them. And I'll give you an example from my professional career. So I have a small law firm. I've had a small law firm for many years. And I had a lawyer. He was very smart, very good lawyer. And we're still friends to this day. But I had a program at the firm, and I still do, where if someone brought in a case, let's say on a contingent fee basis, I would pay them participation in that case. So on a contingency fee basis, if you bring in a contingent fee case and we get a third of the money, I will give you a third of the third, less the value of the hours you've already spent on the case as a bonus. I'm always looking for ways over the course of having this small firm where I can squeeze some extra money out for the employees to give them bonuses whenever I can. And I would even give them bonuses if I brought in a contingent fee case but assigned it to them to handle. I've always wanted to, we can't pay as much money as the big New York firms, but I always want to give the lawyers and employees at the firm ways to make some bonuses. But this created tension between me and this lawyer because the lawyer wanted that third calculated on the gross that we made on a particular case. So let's just keep it simple. If the case settled for $300,000, he just wanted $100,000 off the top. But the problem is taxes. And I tried to explain to him, look, any settlement, your participation has to be net of taxes. So if we have $300,000 and we have to pay $100,000 in taxes, just saying, all in, then your bonus has to be calculated on the $200,000. You get a third of that, not a third of the $300,000. And that just drove him to distraction. And at one point he got angry and said to me, "Taxes are your problem." Well, that didn't go over very well. And it really created kind of a tension between us. Ultimately, he left the firm. We reconciled. We're still good friends. I talk to him all the time. But first of all, that was not a smart thing to say. Saying taxes are your problem and throwing it in the other side's face is not a great idea. But second of all, no, taxes are both of our problem because I can't pay bonuses, especially in a small firm, on money I don't have, you see. Here, the way this went was there was a discussion about revenue sharing, which was a very important issue here. The way it works is the WNBA obviously is going to generate money from TV deals, ticket sales, merchandise sales, sponsorships, expansion fees. From that money coming in, the players want a piece of that. They want a percentage of that to be set aside to be applied to the salary cap. So the more money the league brings in, a piece of that should go to the players, according to the players union, and the salary cap should increase as more money comes in through the revenue share. So here's the bone of the disagreement here. The players wanted the revenue share to be calculated on the gross income. And management, Kathy Engelbert, wanted the revenue share to be calculated based on the net after expenses. And that was a problem going both ways. When players negotiate for a share of gross revenue, they're basically saying, look, we help generate the top line number through the ticket sales, the TV deals, the merchandise, and we want our cut of that before your cost decisions come into play. So put another way, the key insight here is that many expenses are actually ownership choices, right? How fancy the arena is, executive salaries, travel upgrades, marketing spend. And if the players accepted a net revenue share, then the owners could theoretically inflate expenses and shrink the players' slice. And that's the main reason the WNBA dispute was so contentious. The league was offering deals based on net revenue after expenses, and the union was pushing for gross revenue and wanted expansion fees, money coming in through new franchises included. So from the player's perspective, agreeing to net revenue meant trusting ownership to manage costs fairly. And while perhaps they trusted Kathy Engelbert as a person, obviously trust but verify, and giving full discretion to the league to determine the amount of expenses that would be netted against the gross to leave the share for the players that would go into the revenue sharing program was just a bridge too far. That is a lot of trust to extend to the other side of a negotiation table. Let me take a side tour for a minute there. Let's talk about how the NBA does this. The NBA basically uses a hybrid. So in the National Basketball Association, players get roughly 50% of what's known as basketball-related income, which is a defined gross revenue figure that excludes some costs like, for example, arena construction debt. So it's neither pure gross nor pure net. It's sort of a negotiated definition of a revenue pool. And the fight is always over what counts as a deduction toward that pool and what doesn't. Gross revenue sharing obviously is much simpler and much more player protective. But looking at this from the other side, it can genuinely threaten a league's viability if revenue becomes thin, which is the WNBA's situation. A team losing money on net could still owe players a growing gross share. And that's why the WNBA claimed it risked losing hundreds of millions of dollars under the players' gross revenue proposal. But they ultimately struck a deal. Why? Because both sides were patient. And it looks like the deal was there would be an average revenue share of about 20% paid into the players' participation pool. And that figure, that 20%, is almost certainly a negotiated hybrid. I don't have the deal documents in front of me, obviously, but I'll bet you it's a defined revenue pool that contains agreed exclusions on both sides, kind of like what the NBA does. The details of exactly what's in and out of that pool is obviously in the actual CBA that I don't have. But the bottom line is that revenue sharing isn't really about ignoring expenses. It's about who controls which expenses are going to count, right? So that's a negotiation within the negotiation. And in my example, with the lawyer that I was negotiating with over essentially a revenue share, I was working with a defined number, just the tax number. I wasn't trying to charge any expenses against the share that would be paid to the employee. I was just trying to get taxes deducted from the gross before we did the share. That's where the fight's going to happen. And listen, if you're on management side, you see that the players now know that you have brought in enormous expansion fees for new franchises. You've brought in over $70 million in financing. You've brought in a huge new revenue deal. They're going to want a piece of that. And that's what I mean when I say people don't want to hear about labor pains. They just want to see the baby. They don't want to hear about the sacrifices you made to make your business or league work. They don't care that you were working on weekends. What they want is a piece of the revenue that they helped bring in. And that's the tension here. But eventually, they got that deal done. And in the early hours of Wednesday, March 18th, 2026, it happened. And they finalized the deal. Kathy Engelbert and the Players Association leaders got together in the main conference room of the Langham Hotel. They handed out glasses of champagne, and Alicia Clark, who's with the union, gave an emotional toast. And both sides, who weeks earlier had been describing each other as dismissive and disrespectful, stood together celebrating what they'd built. And some of the things they built were pretty remarkable. The salary cap jumped from $1.5 million to $7 million. That's nearly a 5 times increase. Remember, the players wanted $9.5 million, so they compromised on that. The Supermax, which is the highest salary available to any single player, it went up from about $250,000 to about $1.4 million, and it will grow to $2.4 million by 2032. As I said earlier in the podcast, the average player salary went from $120,000 to about $583,000, and it's projected to exceed $1 million by 2032. Minimum salaries went up. They instituted the first ever revenue sharing model in women's pro sports, as I said. And so this was a win both ways. And what we can say is that the new collective bargaining agreement tied payer play directly to league growth for the first time ever. So whatever the exact formula, both sides, management and labor, now benefit when the league grows. So you have an alignment of incentives here, which is a wonderful thing. And that's arguably more important than whether the revenue share is technically gross or technically net. And there's some other benefits in terms of housing and rookie pay going up and player experience. For example, players will now be entitled to first-class travel accommodations, enhanced team facilities, and pregnant players get a de facto no-trade clause, so you can't trade them if they're pregnant. So very complicated negotiation. It's successful, and we're going to see where this goes. It's interesting that the deal created the first comprehensive revenue-sharing model in women's professional sports history. Just a very, very interesting negotiation. And as I said, Kathy Engelbert, very tough negotiator, very smart person. And we're going to see what happens now. They seem to have made major financial commitments, but they have major money coming in now. And I think this league is going to be self-sustaining and continue to grow in popularity with the Caitlin Clarks and Angel Reeses of the world as we go forward. So a great story about a complicated negotiation. And I hope you learned some stuff from it. And folks, that's all I have for you today. Hope you enjoyed this conversation about the WNBA. And this is Gene Killian signing off and reminding you once again that negotiation is life. Hey, thanks for listening to the Station for Negotiation podcast. Until next time, you can keep up with us on social media at the following places. On X, formerly known as Twitter, it's at STN4Negotiation. That's at STN4Negotiation. On Facebook, you can hit us up at facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. That's facebook.com/station4negotiation pod. Over on Instagram, you can reach us at station4negotiation. Again, that's at Station4Negotiation. On LinkedIn, Station4Negotiation Podcast. Again, that's Station4Negotiation Podcast. Over on YouTube, we're at Station4Negotiation. That's at Station4Negotiation. If you want to shoot us an email, you can do that at Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. That's Station4Negotiationpod@gmail.com. So we'll see you next time on the Station for Negotiation podcast. And until then, remember, negotiation is life.